Okay, it's good to see a bunch of people coming back and some new faces. This is great. Uh, we've had a lot of fun doing these. We've got some more coming up, and I met Antonia. It was I don't know how many years ago. I had read George. It was a while ago. I had read the most recent version of "Don't Think of an Elephant" by George Lakoff, and he mentioned Scott Witkoff in Wisconsin as the only person doing this training. And so I thought, well, I needed to tell George Lakoff that we were doing it in Minnesota. And in Minnesota, we also have party support, which is unique as far as I know. And so 6 months later, Antonia emails me back and says, George isn't really good at looking at his email, but I thought I'd try to find out what you're doing. And we just hit it off. We had great conversation. Antonia came to Minnesota, and it was great. She worked with George Lakoff for a while, and just is really into this. So I thought it would be kind of handy for you to see how somebody else looks at this who's an expert in it, because I think sometimes learning the same thing more than one way can be instructive. And I'll also point out that Antonia, as well as Hobie Stocking, who's on this call, are also folks who are helping to start a framing association. We're trying to find the other people in the U.S. who do what we do so that we can be sure that as this grows, we keep track of folks and can direct people to trainers in their area. So if that's you, contact us and let us know. So I guess we'll stop there for the introduction. I'll let Antonia talk about she's worked up a new bit of training, and some of this may be familiar, but I think you will find that Antonia's take on it is a little different. She explains it in a different way, and that's always helpful when you can hear things explained in more than one way. So this is a preview. I think you guys are the guinea pigs. So I'll turn it over to Antonia.
All right, thank you, George. Thanks everybody for coming. Yeah, so why do we need a training program for strategic messaging? We're winning, but we should be winning by a lot more. People support our issues by significant margins, but they don't really understand us. They don't really get what we believe or why we believe it. Due to a well-funded 50-year effort, our public debate is still dominated by conservative myths and assumptions. And to fix these problems, I believe that we have to learn these three things. In session one, so this is about a training program that has 3 90-minute sessions for the full program. In session one, we learn from cognitive scientists about how the public debate works, how language influences the brain on both an individual and a societal scale. This step is critical to ridding ourselves of decades of bad messaging habits. In session two, we learn a common set of themes that communicate our belief system and our values, what we believe to be right and wrong, what we believe is the right role for government, and how our issues fit into that framework. In session three, we learn a set of practical tools to analyze the current debate, identify where we want that debate to go, and actually change it. So today we're going to start just with framing what it is and why it's the key to taking back the public debate. So picture your typical courtroom drama, or virtually any episode of NCIS where one of the main cast members gets framed for murder. Because if you watch NCIS, you know this happens all the time. When someone is framed, the prosecutor tells a story about how the evidence fits together and points to that person. Now, the defense team has two choices. They could try to pick apart the prosecution's evidence, but what they always do instead is paint the picture of a whole different story, one in which all the evidence leads to the real killer, and it becomes clear that our defendant has been framed all along. You know what? It occurs to me, I haven't shared my screen with you guys.
I was just going to ask you that.
Yeah. So you didn't miss the title slide. I think you can live it out. This is, give me 1 second. And here we go. Share screen. There you go. Okay, previous slide just looked like this. This is the second time I've done this. I have a bad habit of forgetting to share my screen. Okay, now we have it. Court of public opinion. All right. So what they always do instead is paint a picture of a whole different story, one in which all the evidence leads to the real killer, and it becomes clear that our defendant has been framed all along. So that compelling narrative is called an alternate theory of the case. So the public debate is like a jury trial in the court of public opinion. So forget the people who've already made up their minds. The jury is made up of people we think of as persuadables. So the conservatives are always going to frame us to be the bad guy. So instead of arguing with the conservatives about what's wrong with their case, we should be talking to the jury and presenting our own theory of the case. We need to give persuadable people a totally different way to look at the situation, one that makes more sense than the conservative story and makes us look like the good guys. So in the debate, we call that changing the frame. So what's happening in the public debate right now? President Biden's American Rescue Plan has been passed, and we've just started to debate the American Jobs Plan. So essentially, we have a situation, an economic downturn caused by the pandemic, and we're debating whether this response is right or wrong. So in order to judge right and wrong, you need some kind of criteria. So frames can determine which criteria people use. Here's the conservative frame. This situation is an economic recession like the one in 2008. In the recession frame, the Biden rescue plan is judged as though it were a proposal for stimulus spending. While some believe the economy will recover on its own, others believe we should limit spending only to what is needed to bring GDP back to where it started and get unemployment back to acceptable levels. Frames can determine what we think of as the right goal. In the recession frame, the goal is for the economy as a whole to recover. We argue about things like the GDP, inflation, and the federal debt. But these cost-benefit analyses totally disregard the cost of human suffering. So frames can block some things out of the conversation. The recession frame blocks thinking about the facts that the people in the economy are suffering, that businesses are going out of business, or that the economy as a whole can recover while whole communities are left behind. Frames reflect a particular set of values. The recession frame reflects conservative values, including the myth that the economy itself is what matters. To conservatives, how individual people are doing in that economy should be left up to the invisible hand of the market. I always want to say indivisible. Conservatives generally believe it is morally wrong to lean on others for help, that we're not responsible for the well-being of others, and that we don't need government to solve our problems. What's our frame? We see the pandemic as a kind of economic natural disaster, like a hurricane or a flood. We understand that disasters devastate some people's lives while leaving others relatively untouched. Another thing frames can do is establish behavioral expectations. In a natural disaster, what is the right thing to do? You find out who needs to be rescued and you rescue them. You find out who's suffering and you provide relief. You make a plan to rebuild and you try to make things better than they were before. Most people already have a natural disaster frame in their brains. For example, when I think of natural disasters, images of Hurricane Katrina come to mind. But how do we get people to use the natural disaster frame? Our job is to connect what people already know about natural disasters to the economic disaster we're dealing with right now. We make that connection by using words and evoking images that switch on or activate the natural disaster frame in people's brains. That's why the Biden team named their funding proposal the American Rescue Plan. We can reinforce their frame by using words like rescue, relief, and rebuild, and metaphors and imagery about storms, floods, fires, and so on. We need to keep saying things like, a lot of people needed those $1,400 checks just to keep their heads above water. All of this adds up to a compelling narrative that gets people to look at the situation and think, yeah, a natural disaster. That's the way I see it too. What are the values behind the disaster frame? Well, when disaster strikes, Americans step up. These are what I call consensus liberal or mainstream liberal American values. Liberals believe that people depend on each other and should take responsibility for each other. What matters is how people are doing, regardless of the stock market or GDP. Liberals believe that societies have to cooperate in order to tackle big problems that we can't solve on our own. Government is just a tool we use to do that. By getting people to think about the situation in terms of natural disasters, we keep the agenda of the public debate focused on the human impact and our obligations to each other and away from abstract economic concepts. Liberals also believe that our shared prosperity depends on public resources that benefit and protect everyone, like clean energy, infrastructure, and scientific research. As we move into the debate over the American Jobs Plan, we should focus on liberal values like the responsibility we have to take care of each other and make wise investments in our shared future. But to expose people to your frames, you have to get their attention, and that means controlling the agenda. So why do we always end up reacting to conservatives instead of talking about what we think people should be talking about? Conservatives understand that our brains operate like a reality TV show. Love them or hate them, whoever gets the most attention wins. If we can learn a few key things about how the brain works, we can stop letting conservatives determine what gets talked about and what doesn't, and start setting the agenda ourselves. Your brain manages everything you know by organizing it into frames. These frames physically exist in your brain in the form of neural networks, kind of the way data is stored in a computer memory. These frames are switched on or activated when exposed to certain words and images. All of these little neural networks connect into massive neural networks that we call belief systems. They contain our entire understanding of how the world works, how we should act in it, and what we believe to be right and wrong. Our society has two major competing belief systems, liberal and conservative, each of which is made up of countless smaller liberal or conservative frames. Many people have just one belief system, but persuadable people, our jury in the court of public opinion, have both belief systems. What makes them persuadable is this ability to mentally process ideas from both perspectives. One thing that makes our brains different from computer memory is that our brains grow and change in response to experience. When we activate liberal frames with words and images, the liberal network gets physically stronger. Excuse me. This is important because when people have competing neural networks, their brains automatically default to using the one that's physically stronger. That's why our mission is to repeatedly activate and strengthen the liberal frames in persuadable people. But here's where it gets a little tricky. Just being exposed to a word or image activates its neural network, whether you want it to or not. This is why we automatically think about an elephant when someone tells us not to think of an elephant. Because exposure causes activation, what's most important is whose frames are being talked about. When we make our case and conservatives try to tear it down, we win because either way, our frames are getting the attention and therefore being activated in people's brains. When they make the case and we try to tear their case down, they win because they're getting the attention and their frames are being activated. So where does that leave us? How do you fight an attention war against people who are willing to jump into a dumpster and light themselves on fire? Conservatives deliberately do and say things that appear stupid, crazy, offensive, easily proven to be false, and or blatantly unconstitutional. These are the things that trigger us. A few weeks ago, Ted Cruz tweeted, quote, "By rejoining the Paris Climate Agreement, President Biden indicates he's more interested in the views of the citizens of Paris than in the jobs of the citizens of Pittsburgh." So liberals went absolutely bonkers online talking about how stupid Ted Cruz is. He got more than 70,000 retweets. Ted Cruz is not stupid. Ted Cruz just played us for 3 days of national media coverage. People like Ted Cruz and Marjorie Taylor Greene depend on us to react. Conservatives have controlled the agenda of the public debate for decades by getting us to use all of our precious airtime talking about them and activating their frames instead of talking about what matters to us. They are always going to start dumpster fires, but we can stop adding oxygen. We should take an oath to first do no harm. We can deplatform conservatives just by refusing to talk about them. So the best real estate in the public debate is the bully pulpit. White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki was pressed by reporters to comment on the offensive behavior of certain members of Congress. She just said, quote, "We don't want to further elevate conspiracy theories in the briefing room, so I'm just going to leave it at that." And that was that. Way to go, Jen Psaki. That if you take all the campaigns, organizations, and individuals on the left and all of their websites, newsletters, podcasts, social media accounts, and groups, we control a hell of a lot of public debate real estate. And leaders on the left actually dominate the social media landscape. Just like Twitter deplatformed Trump, think of this as deplatforming conservatives from all the platforms under our control. Rule number 1, stop using our channels to expose persuadable people to conservative frames. I repeat, stop using our channels to expose persuadable people to conservative frames. We should be using our communication channels exclusively to make our case, to set the agenda and activate our frames in persuadable people's brains. So every day, before you react to the latest crazy, ask yourself, if I had control over what everyone talked about in the news this week, what would it be? Chances are it's not what conservatives are talking about. Figuring out what we actually want people talking about may be the hardest part of this process, but we absolutely have to do it if we want to set the agenda of the public debate. And we can't be afraid to face opposition. There will always be opposition. The key is to be ready for it. President Biden ran on a promise of uniting the country. Conservatives tried to call him divisive for moving forward with the rescue plan without Republican votes. In the past, unity has always been framed as bipartisanship. The Biden team saw this coming and proactively framed unity, not as doing whatever it takes to get Republican votes, but as uniting the country, as doing what the majority of the American people want. By doing this, they made conservatives look like the ones who were out of step with the American people. The Biden team is reframing the political spectrum in such a way that repositions mainstream liberal values at the center. When asked by reporters about the so-called Democratic agenda, Jen Psaki once again nailed it. Is unemployment insurance only an issue that Democrats in the country want? Do only Democrats want their kids to go back to schools? Do only Democrats want vaccines to be distributed across the country? Conservatives have spent 50 years claiming that America is a conservative country and positioning themselves as the voice of the so-called silent majority. Every time we try to advocate for government actually doing anything, they call us socialists. But if you reframe the center as what most Americans want, suddenly liberal policies are positioned right in the middle. This is a great example of how changing the frame can change your position in the public debate, as well as which role you are playing. Government is bad is a core conservative frame. It includes all kinds of myths that portray government as the problem and the free market as the only solution. In this frame, conservatives are always the good guys, fighting to keep government from taking away your freedom and screwing up the free market. A core liberal frame is that government is good, but for decades, we've been afraid to say it out loud. It's time for that to change. To us, government is how Americans work together to deal with crises, improve our quality of life, deliver public resources and services, make wise investments in our future, and protect each other from harm. In this frame, we're the good guys because we want to make government work for the American people. And the American people agree with us. In a recent Gallup poll by a 13-point margin, Americans say they want government to do more to solve our country's problems, as opposed to leaving it up to individuals or the private sector. So every chance we get, we need to use our voices, not to react, but to set the agenda, to paint a compelling picture of every situation that gets people to see the world through our eyes and moves people to act on our values. When conservatives try to frame us in the court of public opinion, don't argue the merits of their case. Reject the entire premise that their case is based on and make your case directly to the American people. We need to define our frames, create the language that triggers those frames, and use the strategies and tactics that launch those frames into the public debate. If enough of us can learn what we need to learn, we can change the entire debate together. It's not just about winning elections anymore. It's about helping people visualize and articulate the kind of country and world we want to live in. So thank you for giving me so much of your time and attention.
That was great. I think you can all see why I thought it was a good idea to have Antonia come on and give us a bit of her take on these things. And if you do have questions, put them in the chat. I don't. Are there any questions yet? I don't think
Nope,
so.
no questions in the chat yet.
Anybody have questions on that,
Just listen, I don't know.
or any feedback for Antonia?
In other words, like if someone's
Well,
speaking,
So I have something for Antonia, and that is, how would you, what you just said, how would you apply that to the climate crisis we're in? In other words, would it just simply be that government is strong and will bring the people together and somehow we'll all have renewable energy and electric cars and everything is going to be fine? Or would it be, well, how would it be? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I've a couple of things. First of all, it's not kind of pie in the sky to say, oh, well, we'll use government and we'll fix everything. I mean, we know it's going to be hard, but the choices are between working together and doing what we can to solve it, or leaving it to the private sector. And we know that's not going to that's not going to work. We know that. You know, we'd like to think that they, you know, kind of get with the program, and some are, like some oil companies are, you know, getting on board. Car companies are definitely getting on board, but the market is a slow mechanism. And you know, one of the things that I talk about in the training is that there are things that only government can do. One of which is get the market to do things the market wouldn't do on its own. One is cooperation between states and other governments. And these things apply both to the pandemic and to the climate crisis. You've got to coordinate between states. You got to coordinate with other countries. You have to rapidly scale up. So only the government can, you know, commandeer, you know, I forget the act, the manufacturing production.
For the Defense Authorization.
Defense Authorization Production
That's the
Act,
one.
yeah.
Yeah, so we can mobilize resources. You know, you need government to scale up, because we've got a time limit on the climate crisis. We have to act now, and we have to act big. And, you know, government is the only way we're going to be able to do that, because the private sector, you know, market incentives would just take too long. You know, it's a slow process. You know, we need to act now, and we need to get on a big scale, and we need to do it. And actually, the American Jobs Plan, I mean, I don't have any problem with the title Jobs Plan, but I would have liked something more like Invest in America or something, because that's a little more like, what's like jobs is like kind of like, here we're offering you jobs. And investing in America is more about like, what are we doing here? What's the feeling, the motive behind this? So I like that that thought of like, we're investing in this country because we deserve to be invested in. But I think also when it comes to the climate, I heard a wonderful podcast interview. Gosh, I'll send you the link. I can't remember the name of it, but this guy, Saul Griffith, I think is the name of the guy being interviewed. He's an energy expert, and he was talking about how one of the things he said was, we're talking to people about this, like, oh, it's going to be this painful sacrifice and all this is going to disrupt your life. And he's like, why don't we ever talk about how great everything's going to be once we do this? How good it's going to be for everybody's lives, getting rid of all the pollution, you know, all the asthma, all the sickness that's going to go away, like the healthier buildings, the healthier communities, like, you know, all these great jobs. He's like, we need to stop saying, oh, well, you know, you can't use plastic straws, and focus on the wonderful outcome that this is going to have. So I think there is a framing of, this is something that that government really is the only thing that can solve this problem. And two, this is a great thing and it's going to make all of our lives better. There will be sacrifices, but we don't need to talk about them. We can talk about them some other time. So
Let me add two things to that. One, in the chat, Hobie's got an interesting take on things. And then also, there's another frame that came up when a friend of mine who's the electric car guy in Minnesota, I don't know if Phil Adam is here tonight, but he needed to go to the legislature and testify about electric cars. And at least in regards to alternative energy and sustainable energy, the one interesting frame is inevitable. Because, and we're already seeing it happen where solar is cheaper than oil. We're seeing countries all over the world putting up wind farms, putting up solar. There's a tremendous amount going on in technology and in new solar formulations for the solar cells, also for hydrogen and just all sorts of things that are happening now. And so certainly the business community has been there, and also the insurance community knows that this is inevitable. And so watching them, you can bet you they're adjusting their actuarial tables and other tables they use because they know that this is inevitable. So just another frame for that.
I should say though, be wary of making the because it's good for business argument. That is a validation of their frame, because you know what? The survival of the planet that we all depend on, because we're living on it, is more important than so what if it did cost a shitload of money? Like, what if it did really cost an amount of money that would be painful for all of us? We should still do it. We forget that sometimes. It's like, it's not a question of, is it worth the money? It's our survival. It would be worth, it's a nice thing that it should happen, that we're going to be more competitive as a country, that we will make money, that there will be jobs. That's all fine and dandy. But the reason we're doing this is because we don't want to die, and people all over the world are already seeing the results of this. So just be wary of that tendency to validate the frame that what matters is whether people will make money off of it. Like, we know that's what some people care about, but we don't need to validate that priority when the priority should be, how does this impact people's lives? Because that's not getting enough space in the discussion.
Good question.
Yeah, I've got a whole bunch of questions here that have been popping up in the chat. And I just want to encourage people to just, look at the chat. There's a lot of good comments in here, but I'm just pulling out the questions. And we have a few so far. There's one that says, asks, how can we frame the issue of these voter suppression laws going across the country? And I'm just going to say to that right now is that in 2 weeks, George and I are doing a framing in action specifically on the voter suppression. And we're going to use our stop, drop, and roll technology with that. So I hope that you could join us for that next on April 19th. And then here's
excuse me, Lisa, you mean the freedom to vote you're going to discuss, not voter suppression? Is that
You're right, because yes, I was at the ASO the other day. So you're right. We're going to pull some of that wording out, definitely. Yep. Thank you, Obi.
So on the question of voting, so one of the things that we need to be talking about, and I was not at the ASO, but it sounds like it very much in line with a memo that I put out a while back, that we need to talk about, like, we keep talking about, oh, but they're suppressing votes as this, oh, that's such a horrible thing. Why is it a horrible thing? It's a horrible thing because voting is our most fundamental right as Americans. And the reason that it is because, we live by joining in a society, we get benefits from joining together in a society, but we're not sacrificing our freedom to do that because we have a say in our representation. We have freedom through representation. So if you take away somebody's representation, somebody's voice in this, you are literally taking away their freedom. They're no longer a free member of, you know, their part. You violated their part of the social contract. So emphasizing the freedom aspect is the most important aspect, because if you take away somebody's vote, you might as well just put them back in jail. And so it's not, and also in order to have valid elections, the point of an election, it's not about purity. It's not about having an election with no flaws. It's about having an election that reflects the will of the people. And if you suppress a bunch of votes, that election, it might be pure as the driven frickin' snow, but it's not reflecting the will of the people. And that's what elections are for. So you have to weigh these, you know, these different issues. And, you know, when somebody says, oh, but there'll be more fraud. Oh, but it's like, you know what represents the will of the people? What is going to make this election valid? Not having somebody accidentally vote from the wrong address. You know, that does not, you know, even if that's wrong, that doesn't change the will of the people. What you want is a valid election, and people have a right to vote that is, you know, an inalienable right. So yes, the freedom aspect of it, I think it's really important.
Thank you. And I'm going to be sending, I'll just let everybody know, I'm going to be sending a follow-up email tomorrow to everybody. So I'll be putting links into various things in that email. And so to our next Eventbrite, I'll make sure that link is in there. Another question, how can we frame pro-choice?
Well, there's actually two different approaches that we can take. We talked about the freedom question there. I think if you look at the earlier stages of the women's rights movement and the pro-choice movement, the messaging that really created the movement and got it, you know, made the first really huge gains was just the message that for a woman, like every person has sovereignty over their own body, you know, physical liberty. Like if you talk to any man and say, under what circumstances should the government be allowed to tell you that what you can or can't do with your own body, they'd say no circumstances. So rather than saying that it's about reproductive rights or that it's about choice or that it's even about abortion, no, it is a woman a human being? Do human beings have control over their own bodies? End of freaking story. In order for women to be free and equal members of this society, we have to be able to, there's no circumstance under which it's okay for somebody outside of our bodies to tell us what we can do with what's inside of our bodies. And I know that I feel like we've backed off of that a little bit, you know, like we've been pushed back by all of this fetus oriented framing. Like there's like the entire debate has been from the perspective of the rights of the fetus, all the medical issues, all the language, you know, partial birth abortion, heartbeat bills, all of that language is for you to be visualizing the situation from the perspective of the fetus. Are you guys hearing me okay? My internet just got a little flaky.
Yep.
We can hear you.
You're good?
Gotcha.
Okay. So, you know, so number one, you only talk about it from the perspective of the woman. And I don't say the mother, because even saying the mother is from the perspective of the fetus. It's about the woman as a person having sovereignty over their own body. Because in this country, I mean, people don't even wear freaking masks, for Christ's sake. Like, you know, so it's not a question of when does life begin. Like none of that stuff matters. What matters is who gets to make the decision and who gets to tell people what they can do with their own bodies. And literally say, if you want to make this illegal, you're talking about putting women in jail. So you want government to dictate to women what they can and can't do. But I think one of the more, like, that's a fundamental frame I think that we need to return to. But also, I had a fascinating conversation with a very conservative Christian family in Texas. And, you know, what they said was, this is a belief, like God, like life begins at conception. God told us so. And I was like, okay, great. So this is you admit that this is a religious belief. And then I said, well, do you know that that is not the case among, in the Jewish faith or the Muslim faith? There are, people of different religions have different opinions about, when life begins. And they said, well, no, I didn't really realize that. And I said, so, so what you're saying is that you want the government to make everyone adhere to your religious beliefs. How would you feel if, we asked the government to make you live by our religious beliefs? And they said, well, I wouldn't appreciate that. And I said, well, pro-choice is the neutral religious freedom position. With pro-choice, you live by your religion, I live by my religion, everybody lives by their own religion. The government doesn't tell, the government's not forcing anybody to live by anybody else's religion. And they were like, oh, wow, I never really thought of it that way. And the religious freedom position allows them to be every bit, it doesn't say you have to change your beliefs. It doesn't say your beliefs are wrong. It just says can you respect the idea that you live in a society with people who don't share your religion, and that none of us want government picking one religion and forcing everybody to live by that. Now, of course, we know there's some people that are not going to have a problem with that. But for the most part, you're really creating an opening for people to be pro-life and pro-choice at the same time. So I am very big on the religious freedom perspective on reproductive rights. And also, I'm a pretty hardcore, every human being is king of their own body. End of story.
Thanks, Antonia. I'm just going to keep moving along. We've got several more
Yep.
questions that are coming from the chat. Is the stop, drop, and roll metaphor a metaphor for Antonia's 3 training modules? And I'll let George or Antonia, either one of you can pick that up.
Let me pop in real quick. Because Antonia and I have been talking and having deep discussions for many years now, we do tend to see things the same way, basically, because I think we both understand Antonia a little better than I do, but how this works. What Antonia is talking about maybe more describes kind of the approach we're working on in the workshop, in the long 3-hour workshop, where we start talking about the science. Then we talk a bit about belief systems, which I like. We're calling it worldviews, but actually I think I like belief systems better. And then we get into the practical. How do you actually do this? And so there's that. The how do you do this part in our workshop is the stop, drop, and roll. First thing you do is you stop and you think about what's going on. What is everyone saying? You, your opponents, what's the public saying? What's the media saying? What's out there? Can you find any frames in what's being said? And see, really analyze what's going on. Make sure you have the right issue, because the Republicans are very clever about changing what the issue really is by their frames, and some other things. And then you drop the things that don't work. So we know that leading with facts and logic isn't going to help. And a few other things came up again tonight. Don't take the bait, because Republicans are going to bait us into doing things. And there's a number of other things that you probably want to avoid doing. And then the role part is what Antonia is talking about with rolling with our values and making this focused on people, on what people are doing and what people are, and what effects policy will have on people. And if you can do that, then that sets you off in the right direction for making a message. So I don't know, Antonia, you are still there, I trust.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I cut off my video because I'm having a little bit of instability in my connection. I thought that would make it a little more stable.
Okay, so you want to respond on that?
Yeah, so I think one of the differences is that George's training tends to I think there's an approach that is on the interpersonal level, like I'm going out canvassing, I need to talk to people, what am I going to say? Or I'm in a conversation, and I think, you know, under those situations, I mean, you have to do a lot of kind of think on your feet, you know, stop, think, pivot, you know. And I think, you know, my stuff is a little bit more like, you know, if you're going to sit down and have like a multi-hour conversation with a team of people to design a strategy to push a particular issue, and you want to work through a process of, you know, asking yourself the questions, you know, I mean, like stopping, you know, stopping and thinking, obviously, yes, we've got to do that because we tend to react rather than be proactive. You know, drop, absolutely. There's a huge amount of stuff in my training that is about what we're doing now that we shouldn't be doing. And the convention, the sort of why there's a lot of stuff that once you learn the brain science, you realize, okay, this seems like it's the right way to handle this, but it's not. You know, we've got to learn that, you know, responding, arguing back, like we need to learn how to ignore what they're saying and be completely proactive about getting our message out there. And I think the more you understand about the brain, the more you really get how serious it is that we stop responding and start really taking control of the situation. And yeah, roll, like it's, I mean, I think it's the same thing. It's just sort of maybe on a different, on a more of a long-term strategic planning scale. Because I think, yeah, you need to, like, if you're with a group and you're putting together a long-term strategy, you're going to want to go through every step of it. What role are we playing? Like in this perspective, what role do we play? What is this? How is this being viewed? What goals are being set up? What behavioral relations are there? Like, you know, what I really want to give people is this toolbox they can use to deconstruct everything they've been saying, to deconstruct what's happening in the public debate, to build a whole new way of dealing with things, and to put together a plan that then everybody they're working with can go forward with and execute. So when you go to the ASO and they tell you ABC, what I want to teach people in my training is how to do that yourself. Like it's great if somebody else hands it to you, but I think you'll do it better if you understand why that, you know, what is the reasoning behind that framing and why it matters. And also, if you understand the deeper construction of it, you'll be able to improvise more on the language. You'll be able to customize it to the cultural groups that you're talking to without breaking the fundamental frame underneath it. And I think, yeah, so it's just putting you in a position where you can really start from scratch on an issue and build this whole strategic process on your own.
Exactly. We both believe in that very heavily, that it's very important for people to learn this skill and to think about it on their own. And between the two of us, Antonia has been very good at covering organizations, some larger national campaigns, especially in Arizona recently, and such. And then my background has been in local organizing at the small local level in the Senate district and congressional district and in the state level. And with people that I go out and door knock and or phone call with, people who are out every day doing it. We need to know this too. And between the two of us, if it's happening at the top and in the organizations, and it's happening with us who go out and do the actual voter contact, then I think we have our bases covered.
Okay, and I knew this was going to come up. The ASO has been referenced a couple of times, and what ASO is, and Hobie or somebody else or anybody else may be able to explain the group better, but it's a group of different organizations that have come together to actually put messages together that we should use. So there was just one last week on winning words on voting rights for all. And what you do is you can sign on to one of these webinars, and for an hour, then there's people who tell you like what you should say. So the difference is from what George and Antonia were talking about is what we do is to teach you how to do this yourself, whereas what they do is give you the messages to say. So it's just a different way of approaching kind of the same thing. If I can, I will try to see if I can get some information to send in an email to you tomorrow, so you know more about what that is.
There's a coalition. The ASO actually is the initials for the Schenker Osario, but with some other folks, they've amassed some money, so they do focus groups and things, and focus groups on messages. And I'm not always certain that focus groups produce the best results, but there's good advice in there. But again, I think that the thrust here on our part is, I think it's important for all of us to learn it. There's no reason why we can't. The people that we meet in the workshops are all, brilliant folks and can pick this stuff up. And we also want to make sure you have tools. So there are things you can say to the people who are not going to get training that at least get them to maybe communicate a little differently. So.
And we have a number of questions and about 9 minutes left. So just time out appropriately. Our Board of Commissioners keeps throwing out resolutions to support Second Amendment rights. So I'm thinking that means they're putting forth resolutions to support Second Amendment rights. How can we handle that in a meeting? And if I misrepresented that, whoever put that question and can unmute and.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that? I lost my connection for a second there, so I missed
Oh,
the
sure.
first half of the question.
So our Board of Commissioners keeps throwing out resolutions to support Second Amendment rights. How can we handle that in a meeting?
Yeah, see, that's a weird one because it really depends on where you stand. Like I know that for a lot of people, they really do have a, like, we just need to get rid of the guns position. But also, like, I dated a hillbilly for 10 years. So I have developed a much stronger understanding of the central role that guns and hunting play in a lot of people's lives. And I think politically now we're dealing with a cultural issue. And so there's a couple things. One is, don't even address the Second Amendment question is beside the point. Something like 89% of the people in this country support background checks. So if you're just talking about common sense stuff, I think, the frame that I like the most is just shutting down the current line of debate and saying most people in America, gun owners included, agree that we need some kind of regulation, including background checks, which are universally popular. This is a perfect example to have widespread public support. But that Republicans in Washington are just trying to make culturally divisive. And so if you can go out there and say, look, whether you live in the city where guns are, for the most part, a very, very bad, tragic thing in your lives, or you live in a place where guns are an important part of your culture and your history and your life, and maybe even your food supply, we all agree on some reasonable measures. And for you to say that, we're being unconstitutional, or, we need to stop this frame that guns are this horrible divisive issue in America. They're only divisive between everybody in America and some Republicans in Congress who are desperately ways to divide us. So I think that's really the best way. Like I said, don't argue their case, totally change the way we're looking at it and use that. I think, we can use that, we're in a position as a majority of Americans, these wildly out of touch and divisive. I think that's the frame you want to go with here. So no, don't answer the Second Amendment question. That's the wrong question.
Antonia, you're breaking up. I'm wondering if turning off your video again might help with your audio.
Yeah, let me do that. Sorry about that.
It happens.
It happens.
It's a Zoom world.
Yeah.
But another question, we have several more. We're not going to be able to get to all of them before 8 o'clock. Maybe Antonia can stay on for a few minutes afterwards, and the people who ask the questions can stay on too, to get to some more of these. But I have a couple more here, but I'll just take them in the order they came. Biden has produced a wedge between citizens who define themselves as Republicans and the elected leaders. How does the wedge strategy fit in with good framing, if it does at all?
Oh, well, I mean, I think that's just another way of doing what I was talking about in terms of reframing the center. So thinking about, uniting the country. I mean, essentially, politics is about, it's all about who's us and who's them. And our best strategy is to build the biggest us possible. And so if all the Republican voters and all the Democratic voters and put them in us, and then put the Republicans in Congress and them, that's a pretty darn winning strategy. So yes, absolutely. The better we can divide the Ted Cruzes of the world from the average Republican voter, by all means, we should absolutely do it. And I think that, particularly because the Republican Party has gone so far off the deep end, and they know that they're opening proposals that are wildly popular. They even knew that infrastructure was an idea, they just never got it. But yeah, I mean, I think it's a terrific thing to do, and it's a lot of framing has to do with where you draw the line, how you define who's us, and our mission is always universalized. Like when you're talking, physical sovereignty, you're talking about your rights of your own body. That's a way of universalizing reproductive rights into an issue that, a man should be able to relate to. When you talk about religious freedom, you're talking about universalizing the issue, finding common ground with even your most opposition around the idea of government not telling me how to practice my religion. So it's about universalize if you can, but build the biggest us you possibly can. So they might call it a wedge issue, but really it's an unwedge issue. We're removing the wedge between us and the majority of the Republican voters in the country, and independents as well.
And Antonia, you had mentioned Jen Psaki before, who kind of made that same point. But I always like to point out people who seem to really be doing this well. I think she's a good person to watch. She's rather expert at what she does.
Yeah, they have a fantastic team. Kate Bedingfield. I'm always worried I'm getting the last name wrong. Kate Bedingfield, the communicator, all through the campaign, they've had fantastic messaging. You can see what they're putting out. That they know their framing, that they're really they're naming things well. But also, one of the things I say is that if you need a shortcut for framing, like if you are on the spot and you're just like, what do I say that's going to have it framed from my perspective? Go to a place of empathy and work from there. If you're criticizing somebody, if you're being somebody, you're not in the right place. If you just thing and go to the place of empathy and get from there. If what's coming out of your mouth sounds like something Pope Francis would say, you're doing a good. And Biden, what's amazing is that Biden feature, like empathy is literally like his greatest capacity. And so I am just loving this, because even when he gets it right, because he's always coming at it from a place of empathy. And so you can, even if you don't understand any of the science or the details, just go to empathy, go to your deepest place of empathy and work from there. And you will 9 times out of 10 get the framing right. And that's what we've got. We've got a guy in the White House who lives from a place of empathy, and a team that understands him and backs him up and puts that into operation in a really good way. They've been positive, never, ever, ever taken bait. They never talk about the other guys. They just put out positive content that embraces everyone. And I'm tickled pink, to be honest. It's such a change.
Think about the
You know.
opportunity that we have now that for the first time, really, we've got that kind of messaging coming from the very top. This is a great opportunity for us because we can be saying things in the field that Joe Biden is saying nationally on the TV. We haven't had this before. We've always kind of wondered why our leadership really wasn't doing it. I have to say Obama did a fairly good job on a number of issues, but really the Biden administration is just top notch on this. And so we have that springboard to go from now. Let's use it.
Okay, it is 8 o'clock. And Antonia, can you stay for a couple more questions?
Yeah, for a few more.
Okay, I know people are dropping off, and that's just going to happen because it's the end time. But there are a couple more questions here, and I hope we can get to all of them.
And quickly for those who have to leave, we do have. We're going to talk about the anti-voter activities in Georgia and otherwise, and how we frame that, and we'll use the stop, drop, and roll to do it. And then we have some others coming up. We'll get that information to you, and also there was a question about Antonia's sessions, and we'll also get you links to those when Antonia has them. We'll have one tomorrow, and there will be others coming. So.
Yep, I'll send a follow-up email with lots of information for you. Another question, how is no taxation without representation as a frame? How would we reword that with modern thinking on communication in the modern world?
Oh, as a former DC resident, I think it's freaking fantastic. Taxation without representation is, I mean, you know how the conservatives are always hearkening back to the founding fathers. You know, taxation without representation, it's like you guys are all Tea Party about everything except when it comes to our situation. Yeah, I mean, essentially, like not allowing people representation is like slavery. Like we may as well be slaves. I mean, the people of DC would be well within their rights to take up arms in revolution. So I say that, you know, with mild facetiousness, but I thought it was the best. I mean, it's on the license plate. I always thought it was absolutely perfect because it really does nail it. It's like, you know, we live in this country and we don't have a vote. So, you know, the stuff I was talking about before about the, you know, the social contract, it's like we live in this society, you know, and, you know, we have to follow there's rules that we have to follow in order for our society to be safe and fair. To be safe and fair. But if we don't get to vote on who makes those rules, then we may as well be slaves.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's great. I think you can elaborate on it, but I think as a slogan, it's I think it's kind of hard to beat.
And there's also a lot of power in that in the idea that citizens in a democracy hold the ultimate power. We're really the ones who make decisions. And yeah, we go through representation. I'm trying to find the words that Antonia used before, but there's representation, but in the end, it's really up to us. And so if we get to decide, and the government is a tool for us to do that.
Yeah, I mean, government, like Biden just said the other day, let's stop talking about government as this faraway thing somewhere. It's us.
Government is us.
It's just us doing stuff together. And we have a lot of stuff that needs to get done that we need to do together. And it's just not fair if some people don't get to participate in that. Like there's nothing more fundamentally American than the right to vote and be, you know, an active participant in the self-governance that is what makes this country democratic.
Okay, on the freedom to vote issue, this actually, there was a little back and forthing going on in the chat, so I'll try to bring it all forward. On the freedom to vote issue, how do you feel about centering on strengthening democracy? But then somebody said, well, that makes it sound like our democracy is weak or like we ever had one. And so then somebody came up with restore democracy, or another thing that was put forward was make the promise of democracy work for all of us. So you have any thoughts on any of those?
Well, first of all, I mean, one of the things I'd like to point out is that framing and slogans are two different things. Those are slogans and work, and depending on the circumstances. The framing is the value-based perspective behind it. So there's a narrative, and the narrative is about, hey, we all live in the society together. If we want it to be safe, if we want it to be fair, there's got to be rules, and everybody's got to play by the rules. And you know what? That doesn't make us agree. What us is that we get to decide those rules. Like, if you have to follow rules and you don't get any say in those rules, then you're not free. And we have, that to have that say is the first and most fundamental right that we have in the city. It comes before everything. And so any language you want to use that tells that story is fine. Just picking a two-word, like we have a tendency to pick a two-word phrase and then never elaborate, never narrative. So it, like, what was Hillary Clinton's one of her things, forward together or something? So in order for a frame to work, you have to use language that triggers that thing. You're trying to access something people already have in their brains, right? So you have to use language that activates that, whatever it is they have in their brains. If you're using language that's so vague, it doesn't really bring up anything specific, you're not really activating it. And also, the slogan doesn't necessarily work in and of itself. There's got to be a narrative behind the slogan that connects those ideas to whatever the situation is. Like if somebody just said bathroom bill, you'd be like, I have no fucking idea what you're talking about. No, there has to be a story behind it, which is that, oh, you have little in the bathroom and some transgender man does a woman is going to come in and assault them. You have to tell that, for on their case, obviously it's a crazy ass story, but they tell those stories because what they're trying to do is make the connection between the terminology, the bathroom bill term, and the fear-mongering scenario that they're trying to create and how it relates to the issue of transgender access. So, we can crank out these little two-word slogans all we want, but if we don't, what we really need to do is figure out what is the narrative, what is the story we're trying to tell, and how many different ways can we tell it? It's not just use these two words. Like, you can use two words if they were sufficient in and of themselves that everybody understood what you're talking about, then they'll work to some extent. But really, we can use all the different language that we want. We can say it in hillbilly, we can say it in urban, we can tell all the different stories that we have, as long as we're making that same point. So the framing is about the reasoning, the evoking, the getting that, saying whatever you have to say to get that person to see, yeah, I see it that way. I see it the way you see it. So yeah, slogans, two-word slogans. We have a tendency to crank those out without doing the background work on really knitting together how they connect the important point to whatever the situation is that we're talking about.
I call it the bumper sticker problem. There are people who believe that if we just find exactly the right words that would be just long enough to fit on a bumper sticker, then that's what framing is. And that's not what framing is.
Right.
As Antonia said, there are different ways to say this, and that is okay. In fact, you want to be looking, sometimes you may change what you say depending on your audience. You may tweak it slightly, but just be aware that there are a number of ways to make your point. And we're not after the perfect bumper sticker.
Right.
That's great.
But good naming, like the American Rescue Plan,
Yeah.
Using the term rescue is a good trigger of the disaster frame. Like when people need rescue is a totally different image a totally different narrative than, you know, get the economy out of recession, you know, or balance the budget, you know, but then you have things like Jim Justice, the governor of Republican governor of West Virginia, said something about, you know, he was supporting the Biden plan, and he said, you know, we got people here who've lost their job, you know, who can't pay the bills because their job just got swept out from under them. And I was like, oh wow, like flash flood coming down the holler, you know, it's whatever, you know. If you're in West Virginia, it's not the Hurricane Katrina, it's that flash flood that comes down the holler and like wipes your freaking house out. So, you know, there's a lot, rescue is a great word in that it does get the basic idea across, but the more different ways you talk about that fundamental idea, the meta message is, this is a situation in which some people have suffered a lot worse than other people. And what matters is not just that the economy recovers, but that people stop suffering. That's the meta message that frame gets across. The natural disaster is the perfect analogy for that meta message, that this is a situation in which we have to look at how individual people are suffering and repair that and rescue them and keep their heads above water and help them put their lives back together and build back something better than we had before. Build back better, also fantastic campaign theme. So this good naming is important, but you still have to tell the story in all the different ways you can about how that name connects to what's happening. And we often miss that point. We just come up with the phrase and then we never make the connection.
Right. Yeah, you want to have you know, that story, that frame, the activation of the frame, and the story that goes with it. This opens a conversation, and for all of us in field work, that's what we want to do. We would rather have a conversation than just standing there reading the crappy scripts we get with our walk sheets. And so that helps a whole lot when you can do that. And then, sorry, I lost my thought there, but we have another question.
Oh, we have 3 more questions, and then I'm not taking any more questions. But feel free to continue to type in the chat because it's actually very interesting what's going on in the chat. So please continue to do that. But we have to stop the questions now. So we'll try to get through the 3 we have left. This next one is a long question, and it may be more of a process question, but I'm not sure. So I'll just read it. Would you please comment on this? In the sense of retaining the initiative in the public agenda, here in Michigan, our Republican-led state legislature was debating 2 progressive reforms, lame duck session reform and legislative transparency. Now, voter suppression has put those bills on the back burner and is taking up all the oxygen. I don't suppose you'd say to ignore the voter freedom issue, but how would we also get back to those 2 progressive reforms?
What were they? Could you repeat what the progressive reforms were?
They were lame duck session reform and legislative transparency.
Okay. I'm not going to address the issues specifically because I'm not sure in what context you're talking about them. But I'd say just like, you know, you have your websites, you have your supporters, you have just put out stories, you know, get your messaging on those issues figured out. Figure out what is the key thing you really need people to understand about why those things are important. Figure out what story you can tell to get that across to people. Put that out to your supporters so that they can share that, and just, you know, focus on using your real estate to try to set the agenda. Now you're in a situation where you do have a batshit crazy legislature doing some pretty horrible things. I don't know. I mean, like, you know, all you can do if you really feel like we need to I mean, if you think those other things are more important to be talking about them, then just talk about them. Don't address, don't give any more oxygen to the other debate. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'd have to know more about like what your what your thinking is behind those other issues, and what your motivations are. Yeah, that's just like a longer conversation. But I mean, in general, all I can say is spend your time, use your real estate, mobilize your supporters to tell your message, and don't waste your time reacting to other stuff.
Okay, two more questions. First, do you have any thoughts about the role of framing in creating identity?
In identity,
Or the other way around.
well, I mean, if you look at the past 50 years and what the conservatives have done in essentially, they took a bunch of basically a corporate free market agenda, put a moral framework around it, and then sold it through schools and churches to an entire population, to generations of people. So you now have people out there who, it's not just that you have some guy out there in Appalachia who's like, well, I think we should lower corporate tax rates. It's that he has an identity where he's been told since early childhood that self-reliance is equivalent to morality, and that if you're good, you will be rewarded with money. And so he's sitting there thinking, I'm not being rewarded with money, so I must be bad, I'm doing something wrong, or somebody's cheating, and then they're, so what you do when, like, all of these issues have to boil back down to a moral agenda, and they've created a moral agenda that justifies incredible greed, acquisition of wealth at the top. But they've by pushing it as a moral issue, as a question of right and wrong, they've got all these people out there who believe that they're doing the morally right thing when they say we can't spend money on food banks, or we can't spend money on, because that's bad for people. So I think the identity part of it comes in. Well, there's a couple things. Framing has a huge influence on who is perceived to be us and who's perceived to be them. And so when you spend a lot of time talking about issues in terms of, conservatives use division to create cultural identity. Just be like, it's you're one of us and they're them, and they hate you, they disrespect you, they think you're stupid. So there's the two most important aspects, I think, are where you draw the lines between us and them, and what the moral foundations are. And so one of the ways in which we've lost contact with a lot of people is by not making the moral case. Like, we just assume everybody agrees with our moral values, and then we just scorn them when they don't. But we never actually make the case for our moral values. Like, so, most people want to be part of something, and they want to be good. They want to be able to get up in the morning and think of themselves as a good person, and they want to be part of a community. And so those are the things that motivate identity. And so if we can reach out to them and say, we think of you as one of us, we're all in this together, then they're going to identify as one of us. And if we welcome them instead of shunning them and criticizing them and pushing away, which we do a lot of, then they will identify as one of us. And one of the and if we tell them we need to tell them why doing what we want done makes them a good person. And we don't talk about that. We just assume they already know and then criticize them if they don't. We need to make the case for government actively improving people's lives, for being responsible for each other, for being in this together. We need to explain them how somebody paying really high taxes in New York City is actually, they're happy to pay to clean up the water in West Virginia because we're all part of one society together. We need to make those connections clear. But yeah, the culture, like I am actually planning to do a future 90-minute webinar just on cultural identity and the issue of identity and how important that is in politics, because that's a whole other, like there's a lot of ways in which framing overlaps with that, but that is in and of itself a big whopping issue. I mean, I've got this whole long story that I won't tell you now about a friend of mine who did marketing and basically sold Kellogg's in the Caribbean by making 17 different ad campaigns, each one tailored to the individual cultural iconography of a separate Caribbean country. So there's that's a huge topic. And I was going to include some of it in the training, but it's so big, it needs its own training. So that's coming down the pike.
Okay, last question. How would you frame the issue of refugees at the southern border?
Well, I had this idea of, I think a lot in terms of like the hillbilly psyche. So I was imagining an ad with some guy sitting on his front porch with a gun, and saying, when I hear about all these guys coming into the southern border and, bringing their families, and I just think that's an American. My family came here, my family did that, left home and came here to make a better life for me. And not this guy out of Guatemala, it busted his ass over 2,000 miles of hot sand to bring his family to a better life. That, to me, that's an American. There's a very important point, I think, that has to do with the difference between sympathy and empathy. We do a lot of this like, oh, poor brown babies under horrible conditions. We're trying to get people to feel bad for these tragic brown people who are trying to come here, rather than, and yeah, that has a short-term emotional impact. It's like, yes, we do not want children suffering. Nobody likes children suffering. However, there's a fatigue to that like that'll work for a little while and then it'll stop working. That's different. That's like, oh, we feel sorry for them, but that doesn't mean we can open the border. What we need to do is talk about people coming here like they're us, like there are, and I think the fact that, so many of our ancestors were, like my relatives came to, moved to New York from Cuba, and other ones came from Italy, and, we need to talk about them from the perspective of what would you do if you were in their situation? You live in a country, there's gangs, there's warfare, there's all this horrible stuff. You can't feed your family. What would you do? They're doing what you would do because they're people just like us and just like our predecessors. And so that makes them American in a very unique way. They're the ones that got up and came here, and that's what makes them every bit as American as we are. And so I think it's that pity is dehumanizing in some sense. That it's not just about, framing is not just about tweaking the emotions. It's about getting people to see things in a different way, in a way that logically leads to the actions that we want people to take. So yeah, so it's the rehumanizing and the putting them, they're not the pitiable other, they are us. And I think that's the best way to look at it. And yes, and not using terms like illegal, but yeah, like talking, immigrants, refugees, people seeking refuge is my favorite term, because they're people seeking refuge. They're people seeking a better life. It's like workers. They're working people as opposed to workers. They're people seeking refuge. We need to, they're not a substance, they're humans. So let's rehumanize and empathize.
And maybe just as a way of closing, I'll point out something Antonia mentioned before, which is when you do this, it's not uncommon to hear people say, I never thought of it that way. And I think a lot of that's because the conservative messaging has been so tight and so formulated that they've only heard things one way, and it's just never occurred to them that there's any other way to think about it. That's happened to me a number of times, and it's just amazing when it happens, because then that starts that conversation. Then you can get into your chosen frame and tell those stories and have them talk about what's right and wrong. So,
but I think also they're always first out the gate with their message.
Right.
And our gut tendency, especially because they do it in ways that are offensive, sound ridiculous, that include errors that we could so easily correct. And it's just so hard for us to resist being like, oh, but your facts are wrong. Or,
right.
Oh, but that's not and we just need to ignore them and talk about it from our perspective. Stop trying to pick apart their case. They put forth a flawed case to bait us into doing that, to keeping us in their frame and having a discussion about what they want us to be talking about. Just freaking ignore them and say what you want people thinking. And that's, that will get us 90% of the way there. That and empathy will get you pretty far.
Well, great. We will we'll get links to you and more information. And as Antonia brings more webinars online, we'll make sure we get those to you also. We'll probably put them on our website so you can find them. I think you can see why you probably want to attend those. So thank you, Antonia, for being here tonight.
Thank you so much.
So nice.
It's my pleasure. It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And thanks everybody else. Really appreciate it. It's always fun to get together. So we'll see you guys next time.
Yeah.
April.
Thanks so much.
Okay.
Thank you, everybody.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
connectionslab.org.